Still have from me, that's yours.
And you picked on me about.
All right, we are reconvening our meeting of the House Environment and Energy Committee with an update from our regional planning commissions on the report that they did for us this off session. And we're going to welcome Catherine Dmytryk and Charlie Baker back to the committee. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having us. So I'm Catherine Dmytryk from Northwest Regional Planning Commission, and I'm also the chair of VAPTA, which is our group of regional planning commissions, the Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies. So as the chair noted, we were required to do this report as part of the HOME Act last year. And I wanted to take a moment of putting the report in context of everything else that's going on at this current moment. So we recognize the unprecedented flooding that's happening. We recognize the housing issues that we have in our state of Vermont. We recognize our long-term goals that have been articulated in statute for many decades, which is vibrant downtowns and villages surrounded by working lands and protection of our most precious environmental resources. And we really think that this report and the recommendations within it help to address the issues we're facing today, as well as further Vermont's long-term planning goals. The recommendations in the report set out some guidance for how Vermont's regional planning commissions would do consistent future land use planning, where we would all designate special land use areas based on the plans in our communities and our region and the set of standards that we all adopt statewide. And that can really serve as the foundation to move forward on 2 additional study committees that happened this summer, the first being the designation reform and the second being the necessary changes to Act 250. We really think that the recommendations that we have in our report will really help to further those 2 other initiatives as well. And I'll tell you that through the process of doing this report, we did coordinate closely with the Natural Resources Board and with the Agency of Commerce and Community Development to make sure that our recommendations were all in alignment. So with that context, I'll turn it over to Charlie, who will start to get into a little bit of a detail.
Yeah, thank you. So Charlie Baker, during the day, I worked for the Regional Planning Commission in Chittenden County, but in this case, we were really working for our whole state association and our chair of our Government Relations Committee. So yeah, I'll kind of walk through the report. So this presentation is kind of an executive summary of the report, if you will. If you don't have time to read the full report, you can just pull this up and get a pretty good sense. If you want to get more details, pull up the report. I'm going to focus our presentation here on these highlighted areas, kind of the goals and recommendations. So if you do want to see, if you want to re-review the legislative charge, definitely pull up the full report or S100. And number 4 and 5 in the report were a little bit more kind of the inner workings of like what we found working with the RPCs and the process we went through. And you'll note that there's kind of 5 categories of recommendations. Catherine just touched on the future land use areas. We'll also talk about how regional plans get reviewed, how our work integrates with other state policy, and that's where we get into the NRB, Act 250 work, the designation study, but also other state investment in communities. And then we were also we put back on some ideas for equitable engagement. And then finally on implementation, which we kept very short and succinct in trying to push the schedule for getting things implemented. And I know you've probably seen this 100 times, but just a quick introduction, there's 11 RPCs. We have about 125 staff across the state providing planning, technical assistance, and project management services to municipalities, the state agencies, and the federal government in a whole wide range of areas, a lot of which this committee touches on. So I'm sure we'll be here to talk about other topics as well. I won't read all of those. And then in terms of the process we went through, we did look at all the regional plans. So all the regional planning commissions participated in this process. And we kind of started with like, how are they the same? How are they different? And they're generally consistent, but they're not entirely consistent, right? So we're kind of like, let's tease out what differences we had, and then how do we get more consistent? So we developed some draft future land use categories that you kind of were like, what are we trying to achieve there? What is it high density? Is it lower density? Are we trying to protect things like natural and cultural resources? And then we developed some recommendations on how those land use areas interface with other policies that I just mentioned, designations, 250, state investments. And then we did go through asking a whole bunch of agencies and organizations. Let me right size this. And so that list is there. Almost all those were included in the statutory request, or might have added a couple other organizations to see if they had any feedback on the draft. Probably about half of those organizations I got some feedback from in the month of November timeframe. And you got the report on December 15th. Happy holidays. And then I want to spend a few minutes on the goals. Catherine has kind of started touching on this. And we didn't list every state goal from statute, but just except for the first one, which is the first state planning goal, which Catherine referenced, maintain the historic settlement pattern of compact villages and urban centers separated by rural countryside. That's right out of statute. And honestly, it's kind of I think the RPC's thing with that is our primary goal that we're trying to achieve. And a lot of things come off of that. A second goal that we had in doing this was, what we see when we see permitting debates and we see residents upset about what's happening next to them is we haven't done a great job in setting expectations about what's going to happen in our communities. Is it going to be developed or is it going to be preserved? And so we see this work as helping to further that effort to get clarity and manage expectations about what is probably likely to happen in the landscape. We have the housing targets that were required from DHCD as part of that housing needs assessment. They're doing this spring. And so how are we going to, we're required to get regional targets from the state, and then we're going to work to disaggregate them down to the municipalities. If we have a housing target for your municipality, where do those housing units land? So we view this planning work as helping to work with the municipalities to determine where those housing units can land in our communities. And then and I think this was just an important note that this doing work on the regulatory side kind of supplements the work that we do with public funding for housing. So, right, things happen kind of in two ways in the housing world. It's either we have publicly funded housing, or we could do more to unlock the private sector and encourage investment in additional housing or construction of additional housing. So we think this is part of that regulatory improvement side to unlock private investment. Climate goals and flood resilience, very important that we address those in this work. Reducing development on our pressure on our farms and forests. Public health, the more walkable we make our communities, the better that is for health. It helps our transit system, economic growth, and just in general, maximizing the impact of municipal, state, and federal infrastructure investments if we're all kind of trying to achieve the same vision on the landscape.
And one thing that's not in this list that I do want to add is that one of the benefits of approaching this from a consistent statewide perspective at all of the regional planning commissions is it won't matter if you're in Concord or if you're in Brattleboro or if you're in Franklin. The same approach will be taken for your community. And so any benefits that come as a result of this planning will be available to all communities in the state, regardless of where you're located.
So now we start getting into the more of the nitty gritty. And we can dive into these as much as you want or as little as you want. We ended up with what seems like a lot, but 9 land use categories. A lot of these, our regional plans already had, if not the same term, something very similar. There may be some of the regions that didn't have one or another of these land use areas. So we did spend a good amount of time kind of having our staff look at these, reviewing it with our boards or committees to see, like, over the summer and early fall, does this kind of capture everything that we should try to capture? I think we feel pretty good about this list now. So the next several minutes is going to be doing a deeper dive on each one of these. Downtown village centers, I think one of the things we'll try to do is also tie this a little bit to the designation and Act 250 studies as we go through this. So downtown village centers, the way we've been thinking about, these are the designations. I think the designation study calls them the core designations. And this is certainly within what the Act 250 study is calling tier 1A or B, but these are tier 1 places. And these are, I think what you kind of expect as the village centers. We have 230, I think, village centers now, and 20 something downtowns. So this is those core parts of our communities. And the conversation that we've had with the designation study is that we would take on the work of delineating those on the map rather than have kind of a town by town negotiated mapping process with the state, that we would kind of facilitate that, have the conversation between the municipalities and maybe have the state look at it. And I'm sure Chris can get into this in later detail when he talks about his study, but the state could then look at our regional map and kind of approve all those areas at one time, rather than have one by one reviews of the map of the delineated areas.
Representative Sebelian.
So what would be the role of the town or municipality in the scenario that you just described?
So, I mean, obviously, a lot of this work is coming from what the town does in their planning work and is built upon that. So, they're the primary participant and driver of this. And then I think, depending on the municipality, if they have capacity or not, we can supplement that. So if it's a town that has staff, we're probably just supporting a support role. If it's a town that doesn't have staff and needs us to take more of a support in terms of staffing the conversation, I think we're prepared to do that as well.
So this would come from the towns.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm. And I think it would come about in a similar way that it does now through the current designation process. Again, most of our towns, there is no staff. And so we meet with the planning commission typically, and we have the rules of the program, just like we would still have rules to follow. And we work with them to say, within the rules, what makes sense for your community. And then we adjust the lines as needed and work collaboratively with them. I envision that same process would be followed. It would just simply be to develop the regional land use plan. And so the state doesn't need to get involved until that.
Okay. So I understand that this would be proposed from the towns. Obviously have some issues that we've been talking with you about. I'm not going to go into detail at this point around capacity, equity of access to the incredible resource that our RPCs are, and consistency around that. So my main question here was just, where does this emanate from? So it starts from the municipality. That's who has the lever. Okay.
But I will also add that one of the benefits of this approach is that it won't matter if the community has the capacity to take the initiative to make it happen, because through the regional planning process, we're going to proactively work with all of the communities. And so it's going to capture those communities that to date haven't had the capacity to take the initiative to be part of this program.
Very good, key distinction, important. Also, to come back to the issue around changes there.
Representative Pat and then Smith.
I was going to ask this later, but since you asked this question, are there instances where there is actual tension or disagreement between what a local municipality is looking for and the RPC, and what we've been doing at our level in terms of changes in statute and programs?
Yes.
Oh.
I would say
Very few.
they're isolated, and they will probably most be related to the transition zones that Charlie will go over in a few minutes.
Yeah, probably not with this
Not with
land use area, but
Okay.
with some others. Yeah.
Okay.
I think my hope, because I'm an optimist, is that by doing more of this planning early, those disputes that happen now, often in the permitting process, should be addressed in the planning process, which is where they should be addressed in the first place.
Thank you for that question.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. We have a town plan in Derby that we redo every five years, I believe. Then it gets approved or tweaked by NVDA. What do you do with NVDA? Or do you work with NVDA? Are you gonna come into the town separately or and discuss things like that, or?
And NVDA is us.
It is you.
Yeah.
Well, I see you've got up here, Associated Planning Development. So that confused me a little.
Sorry, that's our state association for the RPCs.
Yeah,
So NVDA is a member of that.
okay, so if we. I guess I'm trying to figure out, we retweak our plan every 5 years.
Yeah.
And you are part of this, the decision making, whether we've done the right plan or not.
And NVDA
NVDA is part
helps
of
you
that.
with that.
Correct.
Yeah. And that's what we were talking about. NVDA was, part of the conversation. Yeah, they would continue to provide that kind of assistance. That's what we're talking
Okay,
about.
good, all right.
Yeah.
That's good clarification, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so yeah, that's the centers. And then kind of around those centers would kind of pick the term about planned growth area. The designation study is calling these neighborhood areas. And this is, I think, the rest of tier 1 in the NRB study. And we did pick the planned growth area purposefully, and this is kind of getting back to managing expectations as residents. Like, if we have these housing targets, you shouldn't be surprised. And after S100, this is the area where you should expect some change. And so these are the densest areas. I think back to that first planning goal. These are our existing settlements. And so this is where the whole mix of things happen. They include the centers are not always in the center, but you get the idea. And the other thing that we have been talking about, and this summer and winter highlighted again, we need to do more to make sure that we're growing in a flood safe way. And so, that has been on our mind, and we'll probably touch on that repeatedly, that we need to give some space for the planned growth area. It may not be exactly just what is. There may be, we need to evolve, upland in this direction to provide some space to get out of the floodplain and out of the damage way there. So you'll see that kind of theme come up here a couple more times. Anything you want to add to that one?
That's great.
Questions on this one? Okay. And then, so village areas, this is in the, again, maybe part of a neighborhood and designation, maybe part of like tier 1B in the Act 250 study. And the distinction is that these may be the areas that don't have all of the infrastructure for a lot of growth, but they have some, there's a place there. They have, maybe it's just a little bit of infill or a little bit of growth that they can handle. So we were kind of just recognizing and trying to be as inclusive as possible. Sorry, Representative Sevilla, the rural part of the state is mostly rural, right? We have most of our villages are rural. Not all of them have sewer and water. And so this was trying to make sure they were part of the planning and the growth opportunity. It just may be at a little different scale, reflecting what they have to support the growth.
And these are really those areas outside of our core villages that are necessary to keep the villages vibrant and useful and a real important part of the community.
And you'll see again the note about growing in a flood resilient way. Any questions on this one? You're giving me hope that we're clear in this. All right, this one is messier. So then we get to an area, and we just, as we were looking around in our communities, there were some areas that aren't really well tied to the center. There may be kind of the fringe area. It maybe it probably maybe has all the infrastructure, but maybe it's not really zoned very well to meet the state's goals. And so we're like, this could move up the scale. It could move into the village or planned growth area, but it's not quite ready yet. So it's in a transition area. We played around with the term about sprawl repair here for a little while. But then the thing that stopped us from naming it that was really the idea that there might be some communities that want to add some greenfield space to their kind of growth area to get out of the flood zone. And so there may be a little bit more than just pure sprawl repair going on here.
Wouldn't that be captured in the growth area?
It very well could be, but we also know that we have some communities where they haven't necessarily updated their zoning to be meeting all the state's standards for, for designations, et cetera, by example.
Representative Sibilia.
Definition of sprawl repair, and is that in statute?
No,
Okay, and so what does it mean?
oh, it does.
Sprawl repair. It sounds alarming to me.
Yeah. So our statute really talks about, multimodal and, building places that are walkable, but we have areas that have developed, again, I can point to lots of parts of Chittenden County that got developed 50 years ago that are very auto-oriented and not necessarily walkable. And so now we are working with our communities to update zoning to transform those into more walkable areas, but they may not be there yet. So we're not using that term. I just kind of brought that up as something we talked about, but are not using.
So let me just add a little color to the, so Chittenden County, I understand sprawl in that context. So I've heard a term bandied about, which I find especially alarming, rural sprawl. And in the context of, maybe seeing electricity and telecommunications built to existing homes as rural sprawl, right. And so when we hear sprawl repair, so there's one thing between Chittenden County and then there's another when we're thinking about, so can you speak a little bit about what sprawl repair means when we're not talking about Chittenden County, but maybe more rural areas?
Pick on anybody that's not in my region.
Well, and I think your questions are a really good reason why we didn't use that word, but that phrase, because it doesn't really reflect what we're trying to accomplish with this land use area. So in the context of this land use area, which is what we're talking about, I'll use my region for example. If you're familiar with St. Albans town, where the Walmart is, that whole area, there's water and sewer available, but it's largely been developed as, individual lots with individual driveways. There's no sidewalks, there's limited transit, and there's no housing. That area is ripe. To me, it's an opportunity for a transition to bring in more housing, to make it more multimodal. And we have a community that I think is excited to get there, but they're not there yet with their local bylaws. And so that, to me, if we were looking at our land use planning, that would be a transition here.
This is more like densification of areas adjacent to a dense area already. Okay.
Yeah, so it's an opportunity, not this rural sprawl concept that you've heard bandied about. Because
yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, because we really are talking about areas that are adjacent to the ones we've talked about previous, the planned growth or village areas, but they're just, they just haven't updated their zoning, but they could be part of the larger planned growth area.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And again, the last bullet about could include adjacent greenfields safer from flooding and planned for future growth. So that was something that also came up. Okay.
Actually, I have a question on this side as well. It says optional in parentheses. The others do not say optional.
I noted that myself.
There are some small towns that may not have a growth area or have other areas that fit.
Yeah, I'm not sure I actually saw that when I was looking at the report again. I was like probably an editing thing and probably not worthwhile saying that all of these are optional. All of these land use areas may or may not exist in each region.
Yeah, that's good clarification.
And honestly, I don't think
none of them are mandatory.
That's right. Yeah, I don't think that word here is not really helpful. So sorry about that.
It's optional.
Yeah.
in Vermont, all planning is option.
So in a smaller
For the regional plan.
area, say Wilmington, which has a downtown area. So areas adjacent to their downtown would then not be part of this.
It really depends on on how the town has planned and zoned for it. So if they're intending and they've updated their plan and their zoning for it to really be kind of part of the fabric of the center, then it may just be part of the, the village area or the planned growth area. If they haven't updated their zoning and stuff, and then it probably would stay in this category.
Who would make that determination?
We'd work with the town.
But who would make the determination? Who would decide?
If it's in our regional plan, it would be the Regional Planning Commission.
But we hope as part of this process that the descriptions that and the standards that are developed, following any legislative action would make it pretty easy to have that conversation, because it would be like, do you meet it? Do you not meet it? And the gray areas should hopefully be small.
Right. Then another land use type that came up was, I think this started off as kind of ski resorts, but we've kind of made it a little bit broader and call it resource-based recreation areas. So this could be, I think of Basin Harbor in Addison County, maybe in this category, right? It's, resort based on the lake, but also the ski areas. And maybe if a community has developed something around the trail network. So that's what this is, to capture those. In terms of Act 250, I think these are definitely, these stay within Act 250. No question about that. And clearly in these last couple are outside any designation programs. But yeah. Question, just kind of noting that's a different land use area. And this is another one that's, maybe outside of our communities. If we have business parks, industrial parks that are not part of the planned growth area or village area, so it's not really integrated into the community, down the road a mile, we have a space to say, okay, let's identify that it's a different land use. It's not rural, it's a business park. And so we're just generically calling them enterprise areas.
For me, this gets to one of the questions around the term future land use map and whether this is retrospective or future looking. And,
Yeah.
Currently, we're not necessarily talking about creating islands of business parks in new situations.
Yeah.
And so can you speak to that?
Sorry.
Yeah, I can start. I think even when you're looking to the future, you can acknowledge that something exists and the expectation is that it remains static. So it could be, there's a couple in our region where you have to acknowledge that there is this enterprise area. The future is to keep it there and not to expand it, and not to make it any larger. So the future is to keep it static, and that's okay as a future plan.
Yeah, I was saying the same thing. Yeah, our future land use is typically built on the existing land use. So we're going to recognize what is, if it's planned to stay, a town could be going so far as to say, like, we want that to go away, in which case maybe it ends up in a rural category, or some other category to say, no, we want it to change. So that's what future land use planning does. It allows the community to kind of identify what they want to change also. But that's a very local conversation, right? This next one, we kind of debated a little bit about this, and ultimately decided to note those hamlet areas either as points or as mapped, polygon, if to use a mapping term on our future land use maps. Most of them are so small they probably will appear as dots on our plans at a regional scale anyway. But these are just, those kind of crossroad communities with just a few places that aren't yet ready, and maybe they will be. Again, this is kind of the conversation with the community. Do you want to move up? Are you trying to get infrastructure? Do you want to be a village? Or is this just a crossroads community that is going to stay? This one. And then we get into three categories of rural. So this is rural general. This is kind of the low density residential that most Vermonters live in, and not typically commercial, but it's also not the farms and forest land. And yeah, so this is, you know, almost all our communities.
Representative Sebelian.
What does more rural mean?
I think that is kind of gets to what do they want for the future? Are they may be trying to decrease zoning, zoning density in that area. So, like, you know, there are towns that have one acre rural zoning. They may be trying to go to a 5 acre rural zoning. But yeah, again, that can go in both directions.
So that would typically be in. So areas that I'm aware of that happening in, like my town, those are in wealthy areas where we are trying to keep people,
Not surprising, right?
only poor people out, just let the wealthy people stay and live there.
That is the phenomena of large lot zoning, yes. In the fair housing context, we might call that exclusionary zoning.
But it also could be, this line, I remember when we were talking about it, also it came in the context of flood and climate resilience. So there are places where a community might say, like, we just shouldn't be growing anymore here. We need to, in some ways, devolve the amount of development through buyouts because of flood resilience and climate resilience concerns.
Good additional context.
Thank you. A lot of conversations over 6 months to get here. The second rural category is, you know, kind of the working lands, agriculture and forestry. And yeah, I think that's what we're meaning by this. You know, I think you can current use properties, right? Any questions on this or anything you want to add? And then the final category, and we did quite a bit of debate about rural. At one point, we just had one rural, because there's different dynamics going on in the rural part of Vermont. So we ended up with conservation. And I think this is also more intended to line up with the 30 by 30, 50 by 50 legislation from a year or two ago, to say, you know, what are the real important resources that we also want to note are conserved. And it also, in terms of managing expectations, from, you know, property owners and community members, like, these are the areas we're really trying to preserve, so don't expect development to happen here.
Representative Sebelian.
So with these types of areas, this is not a municipal decision. This is a person by person, a landowner by landowner decision. Isn't that right?
From a regional planning context, yes and no. So obviously, if you're a property owner, you have the rights that you have, given the context of Vermont law. When it comes to doing the regional planning mapping portion of this, I expect that it will be very resource-based. So where there are known resources that Vermont has determined are important for our environmental quality long-term, whether it's protecting headwaters for climate resilience or endangered species or steep slopes or high elevations, those sorts of things would be part of this mapped conservation area regardless of ownership. Then you, as a property owner, if it's privately owned, would have whatever rights you have under our laws.
And I think I heard you say that where Vermont decides, which is also not the town or the landowner.
Yeah, or the RPC. And I think partly in this area, like, we have state forest land, and right, there are publicly owned resource that are conserved also. Or there's easements on property, right, that have been acquired.
Well, I guess I would clarify and say that under X 171, towns are doing this work. Towns are doing the mapping of forest resources.
They are doing mapping of forest resources and forest blocks. They're not mapping everything that's considered important at a statewide level, but they are mapping a lot of it.
Yeah, I mean, decision-making in all of that. So this is radical. I would not argue that it's unnecessary, but it is radical what we're talking about doing. I think it is actually, in terms of decision-making, it's sort of radical. So, yeah, and making sure that we understand where decisions will be made and that we are providing for as much input and participation by the people. That's where my questions are coming from. So how are we making sure that our municipalities and others are deeply engaged in these conversations, that it is not happening to them. Coming from a rural area,
Absolutely.
that is the starting place that they will believe this is, as you all like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the things we're talking about are pretty radical and exciting in a good way. Mapping of conservation areas, while it may sound radical, I don't think really is. When in the context of what the chair noted, that towns already map many of these in town plans. And many of these are known constraints that regional planning commissions map through our energy planning process. So mapping of these areas is something that has been done in the past, and there are some examples. And so it's not hugely radical. And so I think the context of how we explain that is going to be really important.
And how the maps are used, which is where we're seeing.
I guess I would also, I mean, I can ask you all, the towns I'm familiar with, almost every one of them has a conservation zone already. I don't think that that's radical.
And that's what, so I apologize, I probably made a face. When you said this was radical, I was like, boy, if this is radical, we've been doing it for a long time.
I don't mean this slide. I
No.
mean the concept of, we're gonna map the entire state for land use.
But the RPCs have been required to do that for 30 years now.
Can happen.
And with our towns and with the state. And so
And why are we here?
it's kind of how consistent is it and how it's used, to your other point. And so, but a lot of these areas have been the subject of, whether A&R, did some mapping, or the town embraced it in their town plan, or the region has embraced it in our mapping. A lot of this it's not new mapping necessarily, depending on any changes to state policy that may, and this is, I wouldn't say largely driven by state policy about conservation policy.
I think we should let you get through. Sorry.
No.
Representative
Good.
Sapkowitz.
Yeah, when you say some portion of managed forest land will likely fall into this category, does that mean that that land would then be not managed? I'm assuming that by managed, you mean like managed for logging. So would that then be an area which would then change the land use, or are there conserved lands under this definition of conservation working lands?
Yeah, now I'm trying to remember some conversation. I think that phrasing there may have come from some feedback from A&R to note that even within some of the conserved lands in the state, that there is some forestry management happening. But so I think they're just saying there's a little gray area here. So don't act like there's no managed forest land in some of our conserved lands.
So this is actually not, this is a land use category, this isn't conserved land. This is a category of conservation, which is different. And I think we should be careful not to conflate those two concepts here.
Yeah.
And we have a map coming up on the next slide. If that will help.
All right, you're ready for that. All right. So thank you to Catherine for braveness to put at least, and note the caveat on the lower corner. This has not been reviewed with the municipalities. This has not gone through any process. This is just, I'll let you.
Yeah, so we did what I would call a desk exercise in our office to just say, looking at our current land use plan and these new categories, what might a future land use map look like for the Franklin and Grand Isle counties? So we're presenting this to you just to really show the order of magnitude of geographic scale of what these different future land use areas might look like. And so if you look at it, and you can zoom in on your own screen, you'll see like what we were just talking about, the dark green is the conservation area. And in our region, we already had a conservation area in our future land use plan. And so we kept that largely the same for the purposes of this. And those are areas of steep slope, high elevation, known wetlands, endangered species, high value wildlife corridors and headwaters. So those were already areas that we had identified as important conservation areas in our region. And so we kept that largely the same for the purposes of these maps. And you can see the dark pink, the darkest pink areas in all the villages. Those are the core. And then the lighter pink around them are these planned growth areas, or the planned village areas. And the transition area that we were talking about, if you look at St. Albans, city and town, the transition areas are really those areas where we know we've identified for future growth, that we know that's where future growth should happen in those communities, but they're not quite in the planned growth area, exempt from Act 250 category. And again, these lines aren't exact. They're just simply to give you an idea of what a scale of the geography that we're talking about for these different areas.
What, Catherine, this is great. And since we're already doing all of this, I presume that we have a map that looks similar to this already. Is that, yes? Like, where would I
In
find?
your area.
No, right here. I mean, so is this? I think my understanding is that we've already mapped all of this.
No,
That's not necessarily true.
because what we talked about several minutes ago about the importance of doing this with our communities. And so this right now is our recommendation about what we should be doing next. But we haven't yet done the work of the mapping with community, of working with communities to do these plans statewide.
So we have all the regional plans, which all have maps.
Yes.
But they don't all have these 9 categories.
Right,
So it would
that's
be
what we changed.
translating the existing maps into these categories. Okay, and the existing maps are done by decision of the local community.
It's done through collaboration between the local community and the regional planning commission.
With the final decision being made by,
The board of the regional planning commissions adopt the regional plan.
Which is the municipalities, right? Our boards are the
They're
municipalities.
represented by this.
for those municipalities that do participate at the Regional Planning Commission.
And statute does allow for, if 60% of the municipalities vote to reject the regional plan, then it's considered rejected.
So just so it's clear in my head, what we are seeing here is the translation of the recommended categories with the existing land use maps that are in your regional plan, or
No, this is a new map that we drew to meet the new categories. I was just saying from conservation perspective that we didn't have to make any changes.
so how does this correlate to the existing regional plan?
So for our existing regional plan, what we don't have is, our rural areas were a little bit different from the existing regional plan, so we had to make some adjustments to that. And then we don't currently map the village areas in our existing regional plan. We only map the core areas. So that is a really positive change. I think that will make our land use planning more effective and representative of what's actually the needs for our communities.
Thank you.
Representative,
If
Go
I
ahead.
could just follow up on that, and that's just one example in one region, but each region is gonna have different ways that they need to evolve their map. Like in my region, I only have one rural category. So to get to more nuanced 3 rural categories, it's gonna take some work and conversation.
I missed the end because you're talking. Can you say what you said?
The example that Catherine noted in her region is going to be a little bit different in every region. Like all of our maps will have to evolve some. And I was just noting it, like in my region, I don't even have 2 categories of rural. I have 1 category of rural. So I got to kind of work with our communities and the public and have conversations to break that apart, right? And the state, frankly. So just the evolution of the maps. And when we talk about the implementation schedule, we'll kind of talk about that. It's going to take a little time to get the criteria more explicit for each one of these land use areas, and then to go through the public process of updating our maps. Sorry.
Representative Stebbins then Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You guys hold a lot of meetings to request, I don't mean that in a negative way, but
Sorry, I shouldn't have laughed. Yes.
to like request input and feedback. And I understand when you're working with the municipality, presumably those folks show up because they're elected and, they've said, yes, I want to be a select board member or whatnot. But any thoughts in terms of how to make sure that, those conversations are really happening and people don't wait until something's being permitted to show up and then go, I hate this, or but I want this and it's my land. And any, like, and do you have concerns about that? Or do you see people showing up more,
Um,
maybe with flooding and everything?
so one positive thing that you did in S100 was you put,
One.
Are there any?
there were many, but of note, related to your question, was that you put in a provision that the development review board or the planning commission couldn't really negotiate down the number of housing units. And so what happened in the planning and zoning is what you should expect to see, depending on what the property owner wants to do, right? I mean, the property owner can come in with less, but the municipality shouldn't negotiate down the number of housing units, right? And that was a step in this direction that you're saying of like, let's have more of the debate and decisions at the front end of the planning, regulation, permitting, so that by the time the regulations are adopted, like people should have some expectation and ability to rely on what's in those regulations. And right now, or what people are used to in Vermont is, doesn't really matter too much what the regulations say. We're going to debate it at permit stage. And if we don't like it, we'll litigate. So I think this is going to take a while, right? So to kind of move the system to realize, oh no, I need to participate upstream to affect what's happening in my community, not just show up at permitting. But I think fundamentally that is what we're trying to do in terms of getting more certainty, more consistency, just more common understanding of what to expect that isn't necessarily there now.
One of the benefits of doing the consistent land use plans and then doing them on essentially the same time period and a statewide basis is, I think we'll have the opportunity to build on education, outreach, awareness on a statewide level, which can feed off of itself. And I'm hoping get more people involved and paying attention. And in addition to that, we have definitely learned, number one, that we get a lot more participation if we always offer a virtual option. And number two, we still need to go where people are rather than expecting them to come to us. And those two things will change. But I think there'll be some benefit to accomplishing this on a statewide level in essentially the same time period.
Thank you.
Representative Smith.
Okay. Can a community decision be overridden by your board?
Oh, bless you. Yeah,
Potentially.
yeah, I guess in theory that could happen. I think, the work of the staff is really to try to work things out before it gets to the board. But you certainly could have things like that happen.
Has it?
I mean,
Has it happened?
regional planning commissions don't really have the power to overturn local decision making in any case that I can think of.
Yeah.
We have opportunities to differences of opinion.
And you've seen this play out a little bit. Sorry, our friend Peter Gregory from Two Rivers Ottaquechee Regional Commission is not here, so I'll pick on him. But you've seen some litigation happen at times there about like their regional plan says no primary retail outside the centers, and they've had a couple occasions now where it's gotten to litigation. Like it didn't get settled up at the front end. The town and the region didn't come to agreement on some of that wording, and so it's getting litigated through a permit process. So yeah, that's an instance. I think this whole effort though is an effort to try to work with our communities to try to resolve those more of the front end in a more consistent way statewide, so we don't have those kinds of things happen.
And then
The reason I thought of that was we've got a 280 acre town forest that we decide what we want to do with it, and we will log it every 10 years or 20 years or something like that. Are you going to be in a position to come in and say, well, we don't want you to do that?
oh gosh,
Or you wouldn't do that? Hey,
no, that goes way beyond the
Okay.
level of.
okay, I was just kind of curious about that.
Yeah.
But I think it would be helpful to just to segue off of what Representative Smith's talking about, to explain what happens in the instances of like a regional planning commission not approving a town plan,
Yeah, and
the
that,
ramifications of that for that town.
and that was the second instance I was going to give an example of, which is that regional municipalities have the option of asking the Regional Planning Commission to approve their town plan. And as part of that approval, we have to check whether it's in conformance with the regional plan, whether it's in conformance with the plans of the adjacent municipalities, and whether it meets all of the requirements of state statute. And in a few instances, the Regional Planning Commission Board has determined that a municipal plan does not meet one or all of those three criteria, in which case they decline to approve the plan. That doesn't take away the validity of the plan at the local level, like it's still that town's town plan, but without the approval, a town can't levy impact fees and isn't eligible for some of the designation programs and some other things. But it doesn't take away the decision of the town to adopt that plan. That's still that town's town plan.
You just answered my next question. Thank you.
Yeah, and I will say, as a matter of course, I think we, again, try to address those up front and do a preliminary review, say, hey, heads up, here's half a dozen things, maybe there were some changes in statute, whatever that you need to address. So we all have a kind of consistent checklist that we use in reviewing town plans, and we do it, 12 to 18 months in advance, so that we give them input at the front end, and then we do a back end review.
That actually just happened with one of my towns where
Yeah.
they sent us the draft plan, like, oh, you forgot this. They were able to put it in, and so
Right.
we were able to prove it.
Yeah, so we do try to prevent those situations from occurring.
Okay.
Do you have, either of you have towns right now that have plans that are not consistent with your regional plan?
We have one town in our region where we determined that it was in conformance with our regional plan, even though there's one area that it's inconsistent. But we have noted that with the town, they know that we have a different opinion. We know that they have a different opinion. And so if there is an Act 250 application that's considered substantial regional impact, so the really larger projects, we may have a difference of opinion. It's happened, the difference of opinion, I think, has happened once in the 3 years since we approved their plan.
And when there is a difference of opinion, what does the district commission do?
It's a mixed bag, quite honestly.
Representative Morris.
Thank you.
No, I don't. Just have to get my muscles back into the.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in our town, for example, Windsor County.
Yeah.
Mount Scottney Regional Commission. The town receives grants for the rewrite of our town plans, and the planning commission does that for
Yeah.
us. They're the ones that create the plan. That plan comes back and goes before our planning commission for approval and the select board for approval, which includes public hearings.
Yeah.
And so that's the process of getting to this point, and it's much appreciated, by the way, because our local towns would be taxed trying to do all of this work.
Yeah.
And also the town plans, once accepted, when you talk about the appeal process for litigation, whatever, if it's within your town plan, then that has more authority or more weight, if I'm not mistaken, within the appeal process. And, but if it's not in the town plan, then it has less weight.
Mhm.
So that's why the regional planning commissions have some oversight of what state statutes are, state goals, state plans, and what the towns want to do, and through that cooperative work session to get there. And aren't there, when it comes to grants for improvements or structures, et cetera, if you don't have that town plan, then your percentage of town contribution towards those programs is more. It is
Or your eligibility or competitiveness is different.
correct.
Yeah. I mean, really, our goal is to work with communities to have town plans that are approved by the regional commission. That's our long-term goal. We don't ever
Right.
want to be in this conflict.
Yeah, right, yeah, we're not regulatory agencies, right? We're support agencies, like we support our member municipalities, right? We refer to them as our members, so we're supporting.
Yeah.
So, we're really, our work is really to not not get into conflict.
And
To help our towns meet the state requirements.
correct, and through this process, if the town decides that we want to go this direction, we still have that right, and we push back a little bit on some of the floodplain regulations, and that's been accepted, so.
Yeah.
That we do have that final say, if you will.
So, okay, if we transition away from the maps. So the next few sections here, one was, we were kind of asked like, okay, right now regional plans get approved really solely by our boards, so by the municipalities, and there is no state level, review approval process. So we are suggesting that that we still continue to go through the two public hearings. We'll go do all that process with our residents and marginalized, underrepresented residents. So that's number one here. But then we recommend some sort of process for confirmation or approval by it. And you can see us hedging here, not knowing where the legislature of a state entity, whether it's a downtown board that's updated somehow or a central resources board. And the plans are on an 8-year cycle, so that's not a change. And really kind of focus on the land use areas, housing, and flood resilience as kind of the three like major things that the state is focused on in that review. I should note, in deference to all 11 RPCs, not every RPC is totally on board with this. So just note in fairness to them. And then also we just provided, just a thought or two about accountability. There are a lot of state benefits, particularly around designations or maybe even Act 250 exemptions in the future or whatever that might be tied into these plans being approved. So if there's, something going on funny in a region, we're like, no, we want to develop in the floodplain. The state's like, no, like our plan doesn't get approved, but also put some pressure on our member municipalities to have part of the accountability system of like, okay, well, your whole region's going to lose benefits here if you don't kind of get it right. So, so that's a pretty strong lever to make sure we get it right and work positively with the state. Sorry.
Well, I'm just curious, when you say the majority recommends, what was your process and how did a regional planning commission decide if they would support or not support some of these recommendations? Was it just the executive director or did it go to its board?
No, when I say that, those are some board conversations. So there were a couple of the RPC boards that I think, I don't know how to express it in fairness to them. So these are my words, not necessarily theirs. But they were a little concerned about, right now they have some autonomy over the approval process. They approve it and we're done. So there was a little, I think, anxiety about the state review and approval process.
And so this report was reviewed by all of the boards, and the boards did provide feedback.
How many of them supported it?
Or two that were concerned about this particular piece, but all of the commissions supported the overall.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. That's the clarification. Now we move on to the designation program. We kind of touched on this a little bit, that, in our conversation with the state, we anticipate that we would do that delineation of the designated areas, and that be included on our future land use map. And so one of the process benefits of that is instead of 1-by-1 approval that happens now, they could approve all of those areas all at one time as part of the regional plan approval. And then just kind of redundant on this, but we're also thinking we need to figure out how to address the river corridors in these designated places. A lot of our villages and a lot of our downtowns have rivers and floodplains that we need to be pretty clear about. We do not want to make those worse, and we want to actually make that situation better. So we need some sort of enhanced state permit program, maybe for river corridors or floodplains. And there's also another note here about multimodal transportation. We got some comments from VTrans wanting to make sure that if there's a change in Act 250, they don't lose the ability under, I think it was Act 145, to get fees from developers to pay for transportation improvements. I don't know if you remember, this is, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago, maybe. So kind of avoiding the last one in has to pay for the traffic signal or the intersection improvement. So they want to make sure that ability is maintained. Pop Act 250. These get more fun as we go. So they've been talking about the 3 tiers. Tier 1, which they divided in 1A and 1B. And yeah, we're trying to say, these are kind of the centers, the planned growth areas that we were looking at, and that they meet the state criteria, good planning and bylaws and adequate infrastructure. And we're being very generic about what that specific criteria might be. But that gets reviewed by the NRB. And if they determine we don't need as much state oversight and involvement with state permitting anymore, okay, we've done the mapping again of those areas. And again, a couple of suggestions about the corridors, Act 145, the transportation piece. And also just one note, if Act 250 is no longer in play in an area, there needs to be a process to deal with those property owners that have existing permits, and how do they move forward so that we don't end up with some weird situation where one property owner is not subject to Act 250 and the next door is just because of history. So we need some way to equalize that. Tier 2, just kind of listing the land use areas of maybe parts of in Tier 2. And then rural conservation, we just kind of said we're assuming there may be some increase in jurisdiction or some higher standard review. We're not sure exactly where the Act 250 process will end up. So we were a few weeks in front, so we were kind of purposely vague here, but don't read too much into that. And I think, and we're also kind of noting under Tier 3 that we can support the mapping of what those Tier 3 areas might be, as long as we're getting some good technical guidance from the state and from A&R in particular. Yeah, we got like 10 minutes. I think we got like 2 slides here left. Capital investment, and we just kind of listed the types of investments that would be most appropriate from different land use areas. So the more, I'll use the term urban, but little u. But where we have water, wastewater, sidewalks, where we're trying to create walkable communities, that's the widest suite of investments. But also all the way down to rural, noting the state makes investments in rural areas too, around clean water, working lands, conservation easements, trails, etc. So I don't think anything too complicated there, other than to note that a lot of those capital investments, the guidance in whether some may be in statute, but in rule or guidance at the agency may refer just to the strict designation areas. So we're hoping, like if it says village center, no, maybe it's a whole village area that could get a sidewalk, for instance, or get more priority in that state investment decision. This slide is just to note that we did take a look at kind of best practices for equitable engagement. And so you'll see kind of some shoulds of what we as planners should do locally to engage more. So we spent some time on that. And I think good support for that. And then finally, implementation timeline. And this was just from us. So, because we're talking about other people here too, right? But we're kind of saying, working with the NRB and DHCD, there certainly needs to be training and engagement statewide on all this. And then when we get down into the details, we were thinking that we would be happy to work on the guidance for the land use criteria and try to get that done within 6 months. And then these are push timeframes. So, and I know sorry, I'm feeling my Chris Cochran here. He probably wants more than 12 months, but
Just giving more staff training.
yeah, there you go. But we need if designations are going to be updated, we're like, let's get that guidance done as quickly as possible within the year. Same thing with Act 250 is Act 250 is getting updated. Let's try to get that rulemaking done as quickly as we can. And then the guidance on the conservation area, Tier 3 mapping, also within the year. And then we were thinking, assuming that's kind of like June 30, 24, or July 1, 24, that things go into effect, that we probably need 2 years with all this guidance being done to actually get regional plans done. Some of us, I think, personally, I know I'm going to move faster than that. As long as we've got some guidance that I can rely on. But others were like 2 or maybe 3 years, because we know that if the state there's a lot of other things that are relying on this mapping. We don't want to be the thing that's holding up other processes and decisions. So we're feeling the pressure.
Do you have a question?
Mm.
Representative Skilling? Well, we do need to kind of wrap this one
Yeah,
up.
I'm done.
And we're going to take a break, but go ahead.
Yeah.
Your question.
Of course. So 2 years. So one of the RPCs, as you know, has 55 towns, which is not equitable. It's a big problem. Hopefully, we're going to spend some time on 2 years to update the plans for 55 towns. The regional plan
The regional plan,
The
right?
regional plan. Yeah.
for 55 towns.
That's
2 years.
That's a typical
Yeah.
planning timeline.
It's every 8 years you have to redo your plan.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think typically a region probably starts 18, 24 months. Maybe in some cases they start a little, maybe 30 months in advance. So this is kind of giving that same kind of time frame that we all take to update our plan.
I mean, it's not just updating the regional plan. I mean, there's changes. That's what I'm reacting to. And then 3 slides back, I had a question on not that one. There you go. Tier 3.
Yeah.
And so I have a very specific question because it's what's in my head. I think about my kids. So this is a different area. I live in a rural town adjacent to a tourism area. But I think about Sam Lincoln, who lives in a very rural area, like a land use area, and has talked about, his kids, wanting his kids to be able to build on his land, which I think is probably rural conservation. So are we making that harder here? For people to build on their land for someone who owns a farm, for their kids to build on it?
I would hope not. I mean, but you're saying he's in a conservation, so he has.
Well, I don't know if he's in
If he has-
conservation.
I mean, if there are natural resources that the state is trying to protect
Yeah.
there, I don't want to say it wouldn't be harder. Like it might be harder, but if it's just, a rural resident, it shouldn't be harder.
I'm just worried that we are making the rural areas only for wealthy people, and that like my kids or Sam's kids cannot come back and live in those communities. I think there's a lot of detail to that, and hopefully we'll have those conversations as part of this, but that's.
Our recommendations for the majority of rural areas would fall into the rural general or the rural agriculture forestry. And our report at least does not recommend any changes to the regulatory scheme in those areas. So
That's right.
I think where there could be some potential change, and of course it's all up to all of you, is in those highest value conservation areas. So that was where there would be some potential change, maybe with some, if you move forward on the recommendations from the Natural Resources Board, maybe with some additional regulatory approach with Act 250, but I don't know that it would get down to the one new house level.
Yeah, not at all. And I actually do want to follow it up because it kind of reminded me of back to the housing targets idea, right? If we work with all the municipalities in our region and say, hey, here's your share, every town should have a share, including the most rural towns, which almost by definition means it's going to be the type of development you're talking about, rural, however that person might want to do another house on their land. So I think the intent is to have the whole state share in meeting those housing targets, and not, there's nothing in here that says it's got to shift 100% one way or the other. Like there's a shared effort.
Thanks, Shirley, and I apologize. I had to leave to go testify on another bill, and I missed that part. Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing the questions.
All right. Thank you so much for your hard work on this off session and for your presentation today. I want to make a public service announcement. The room capacity is 16 and we're going to stick to that, and we're okay right now, but I know a lot of you are going to be interested in this topic ongoing, and other folks watching are going to be interested, but we know that everyone's getting sick and we need to stay healthy. And one of the ways we stay healthy is less density in our rooms. So I'm going to stick to that. And we have an open window. We'll try to keep the air quality good, but I just want everyone to understand that we have a representative out, so we can have an extra person in here today, but room capacity is currently 16. Let's take a 5-minute break. We'll be back at